online, and then we'll get started. Then get started, and then we'll get started here after you do your introduction.
All right, welcome everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives. Super excited today. We have Fadhel Kaboub, who will be talking to a group of economic, just folks desperate to have democratic socialist ideas brought into the 21st century that we can pay for them. And Fadhel is here to provide that backdrop. Fadhel, tell me a little bit, what are you guys going to be talking about there, sir?
Well, I'll let Adam do the introduction, and I'll get started in a minute.
Very, very good. All right, with that, let me bring you to Adam.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to Paying for Economic Justice. My name is Adam. I am a member of Columbus DSA, and we are so excited to share this event with you. Columbus DSA is the Central Ohio chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, which with over 30,000 dues-paying members is the largest socialist organization in the country. DSA fights against the abuses of patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism by organizing campaigns and providing education like this event. So, like many progressive groups, we advocate for raising the minimum wage, enacting a Medicare for all single-payer system, guaranteeing free college education, and making other significant changes to our society that address income inequality and the needs of the most vulnerable. But as a democratic socialist organization, we also believe in a radical restructuring of the economy because we know that any victories won for the poor and working classes can and will be undone, like the ongoing effort to dismantle the New Deal and the constant push for right-to-work legislation, unless those same poor and working class folks actually have some power over the economy. So in DSA, we talk about democratizing the economy because even though we elect politicians to purportedly represent us in government, the people who have some of the most direct control over our lives, our employers, can dictate when we work, where, for how much, and in what conditions. And we have little recourse to challenge these decisions, even if they violate the law, because we need our jobs to survive. So that's why we in DSA so strongly support labor unions, worker-owned co-ops, and publicly owned programs that are foundational to a free society, like single-payer health care, among other plans to give workers real control over the economy. So programs like single-payer are essential to worker power because tying health care to employment means that our literal physical survival is dependent on having a job. And that makes us desperate and vulnerable. And it means that we have to compete more and more against one another for a finite number of jobs that provide less and less. So imagine living in a country where healthcare was a right and not a financial burden. Imagine what you could do or build or create without being chained to a job to pay for basic healthcare needs. With single-payer and other universal programs, workers could organize and build power with less fear because even if they were fired in retaliation, they would still be able to survive. So now we see the United States is regularly appropriating absurd amounts of money for military spending, recently $700 billion, and delivering tax cuts for the wealthy. But when we suggest and demand programs like Medicare for all that would benefit everyday people, we get scolded. It's unrealistic. It's too expensive. Have you seen the national debt? We could never afford it. So what's the deal? Do we have the money or do we not? Can we pay for economic justice? So to help us answer this question, we reached out to Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, Assistant Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Binzagr Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. I practiced that. Yes. The Binzagr Institute for Sustainable Prosperity is an independent public policy think tank dedicated to the promotion of interdisciplinary research in the service of an improved quality of life for all members of society. And we thank Dr. Kaboub for joining us, and we also thank Real Progressives for live streaming the event through their Facebook page. And if you're local to the Columbus area, we encourage you to come check out Columbus DSA at one of our local meetings on Facebook or on Twitter. Or if you're listening from somewhere else, check out a DSA chapter in your area. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kaboub. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Steve, and Real Progressives for live streaming this this event. It's a pleasure to speak to you about these important issues that we all face. Here's a brief outline, a sketch of what truly progressive public policy would include. We're talking about decent jobs at a living wage and benefits. We're talking about universal health care coverage, parental leave, child allowance, free education, social and economic justice in the broadest sense of the term, clean air, clean water, clean energy. I mean, we do have to include clean water these days. It can't be assumed anymore. Public transportation, better infrastructure, green infrastructure, safety standards. This is what we're talking about. But then even some of our progressive friends, even some in the Green Party, will tell us, well, these are all great things, but how do we pay for it? Can we afford it? The government can't just pay for it, and the wealthy are not going to accept higher taxes. It's going to be politically impossible. So we just have to settle for some sort of minimum. And this is not the neoliberal voices. These are some of my friends who say we can't afford these things. So I'm gonna push back and challenge these ideas today. We're told that the government is broke. We're running out of dollars because you need dollars to pay for these things. The rich will never agree to pay higher taxes. The national debt is a burden on future generations. We hear this all the time. During election seasons, you get these little postcards from candidates from all kinds of political parties with pictures of sad-looking children, and the message tells you, why do you want to add to their burden, the debt burden that they have to pay for in the future? And then there's the whole fear of inflation and hyperinflation, and look what happens to Zimbabwe, look what happened to Venezuela, look what happened in Weimar Republic. We don't want that kind of inflation spiral to happen from just the government offering to pay for everything. And then there's the whole thing, we need to borrow more from China, and there's the whole foreign policy implications. We're going to be invaded by the Chinese or whatever. So these are the common myths that you hear, not just from the right, but also from the Democrats and from progressives of all kinds. So what I want to suggest today is sets of policy solutions that can be done at the federal level. And most of you are familiar with my work. Most of the time I talk about the job guarantee. I talk about what the federal government can do to address these public policy issues. But today I also want to suggest that there's lots of things that can be done at the local level. Because I came to a conclusion recently, I should say after the last election, that it's going to be a waste of time trying to get things done at the federal level. We still should, advocate and push for, educating the general public, educating Congress and people running for federal office, for national office, about what the powers of the federal government are in terms of financial capabilities and what can be achieved. But I'm also realistic that it's unlikely that any of this is going to happen anytime soon. Although at the national level, if you've been paying attention to media discussions in the last few days, there's been lots of discussion about the job guarantee as part of it's on the table, which a few years ago it was just a theoretical discussion that some people have in academia. So I'll be talking specifically about the job guarantee program today. I'll talk about the importance of raising the minimum wage, the living wage, the importance of having some sort of new RFC. If you remember the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which came out of the New Deal during the Great Depression, an extremely important federal agency to build infrastructure and finance even research and development and things of that sort. It can be reinvented for today's world, for today's economy, with a green purpose, which is important. The idea of postal banking, which most people believe that this is something that European countries do or developing countries do. The United States did have a postal banking system that was very successful, to the point that it was created lobbying against it to shut it down because it was, cutting into the predatory lending business that the Wall Street banks and major commercial banks were engaged in. This should be on the table. Again, this is at the federal level. The CFPB is Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which was created by the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, is already under attack. To weaken it, to dismantle it, to make it go away. How do we protect the average person from predatory lending if we eliminate this office? A single payer healthcare system. There's lots of discussions about how it can be done. There's dozens and dozens of examples around the world of how it can be done, how it can be financed, how effective it can be. The naysayers are just distracting our attention from the major policy goals. And then canceling student debt, which is, in the case of the United States, I'm not talking about other countries, this is unheard of in the history of the universe to have, the core group, younger people, the future of the country, being burdened by massive amount of debt for the first 20 some years of their careers. It's just, bad policy, nonsense. And I'm going to put a plug here for my colleagues from the Levy Economics Institute, who just published a major policy report on the economic impact of canceling student debt. And I can give you the short answer. It's a positive impact on the economy across the board. So I'll invite you to check it out at levy.org, the Levy Economics Institute. So then I want to talk about this is the outline, by the way. I'll go into details as we go. Then I want to zoom in and focus on what can be done at the local level, at the state level, at the city level, a city like Columbus, or even at the municipal level. Ideally, obviously, a lot of these things can be done at the federal level much more effectively. Funding comes from the federal authority. The implementation, the management, the selection of these projects can be done at the local level in a decentralized way, bureaucratically speaking. But here, if the federal government is not going to do anything about these issues, what can we do to address some of the root causes of the problems that we deal with? And the main philosophical approach is to have a forward-looking spending approach as opposed to a backward-looking spending approach. So forward-looking, by which I mean, address the root causes of potential problems before they even occur. So instead of building prisons for juveniles, why not fund after-school programs and sports programs and things that actually prevent the problems from happening in the first place? So having that philosophy of preventative spending as opposed to let the problems arise and then treat the symptoms of the problem at the end. It's much more expensive. It's much more painful for society. So that's at the philosophical level. But then there's the idea of state banks or public banks to eliminate the predatory lending practices, to cut the middleman, and to leverage state funds and state resources for local economic development. And there's quite a bit of interest in this in the last few years. I mean, literally in the last few months, there's all kinds of cities across the country, Seattle, LA, in New Jersey, and every other state has at least a committee or a group that's at least conducting a study at this point to make a proposal for setting up a public bank at the state level or at the city level. And here in Columbus, we're also having a conversation about this. So you'll hear more about this maybe in a few months, hopefully. And then finally, the idea of complementary currency. So if the local authority at the state or city level is not able to print dollars, because that's illegal, only the federal government can print dollars. The local currency that can be leveraged and directed towards community development programs. And I'll talk about the specifics when I get to this. So most of the presentation will focus on the federal stuff, but then I'll zoom in later and talk about what can be done at the local level. And with that, we'll get started. So some of you are familiar with the term MMT or the hashtag MMT or sometimes hashtag learn MMT. The term modern monetary theory or modern money theory sometimes is referred to is this approach that invites us to focus on one particular distinction, which I'm highlighting on this slide, that what we call monetary sovereignty or financial sovereignty is something that the federal government of the United States enjoys exclusively by virtue of being the sovereign, meaning it's the only authority that actually prints the US dollar, that issues the currency, as opposed to the local state authorities, local municipalities, you and I, corporations, nonprofits. We can't print our own money. We can't print US dollars. We're the users of the currency. So we operate in completely different spheres from the federal government. So as the issuer of the currency, the federal government has to spend money into existence, into circulation in the economy, so that the rest of us can use it to buy things, to borrow and lend from each other, to invest, to do all kinds of things. But we don't have the capacity of creating it into existence. So the distinction between users of the currency and the issuer of the currency. And here, there's an important point of logic that most people miss, including the most progressives, in terms of what does it mean for the federal government to be financially sovereign? It means that by definition, it has to issue money into existence first. So spending money is the only way that we would have dollars in circulation in the economy. And then taxing some of that money out of the system comes later. It's illogical for us to say it's taxpayers that fund government spending. It's completely illogical. Government spending comes first. Taxes are collected later. Most of us have it backwards because you fast forward a couple hundred years and we see the chicken and the egg story in the backwards way. But if you start from the beginning of the beginning, and there's a long history, lots of literature about this, in every single human society, the sovereign issuer of the currency always creates a deficit for itself, and that deficit becomes a surplus for the non-government sector. So on day one, the sovereign issues currency and pays people to do things in the public sphere. And then at the end of the year or the end of the month, the sovereign collects taxes. And those taxes, if the sovereign issues $100, and then at the end of the month collects $100 in taxes, we call that a balanced budget. A lot of people like balanced budgets, right? But what does it mean? It means that the sovereign gave the private sector $100, and then it took it back. It's 100% tax rate. That's what a balanced budget is, which means the private sector has no wealth, no net assets left. It destroyed the private sector. So if you look back at history, it's always the case that the sovereign issuer of the currency always spends a lot in the beginning and collects maybe 20, 30% taxes, 40% taxes, depending on the situation, which means whatever the government didn't collect back in taxes is actually kept in circulation in the private sector, in what I call the non-government sector. So to the penny, the deficit of the government is exactly equal to the surplus of the non-government sector. And I'll show you the data for the US or for any other country just to confirm this. But it's important to get the logic. What comes first? Spending comes first at the federal level. Taxes come later. Whereas for you and I, for states and municipalities, it's the opposite. And this is really where a lot of people get confused. You and I have to work hard, earn an income, so we can spend, right? The state, same thing. The state has to collect tax revenues in order to fund schools and infrastructure and so on. We can also borrow up to a limit. My bank will let me borrow up to a limit, but then I have to work hard and pay it off. Same thing for states and municipalities and corporations and nonprofits. Our funding mechanism, the logic of the funding mechanism is very different. It's the exact opposite of the federal government. So this is what the lens that MMT allows us to make that distinction. And that's why for the rest of the presentation, when I talk about MMT, I'm talking about the federal government and what it can do with that sovereignty. And then when I shift back to the local level, we're going to have to go back to the other logic, which is, what kind of tax revenues can you collect at the local level to fund programs? And then in a sort of innovative way, borrow a little bit of the concept of sovereignty from the federal government and implement it locally through a local currency controlled by the local authority. Right? If the federal government refuses to use its power to pay for social justice and economic justice, there's a little bit of space that states and municipalities can use, but it's still limited sovereignty because you don't have that full capacity that the federal government has. Any questions so far about the point of logic? Because it's a counterintuitive at first, But if we all agree that, a dollar bill cannot exist in circulation unless it has come from the issuing authority, which is the federal government. Yes, please.
It's not exactly a question, but I would love to see a diagram of that flow. One for the sovereign monetary one, and then the other one for local and state.
There's quite a few MMT diagrams that explain this, but it's mostly at the federal level. But we should work on some
great.
for
it's a lot to remember and to absorb.
Right
in that first 5 minutes that you're talking.
Yeah, I mean this. The MMT approach, where I see some familiar faces in the audience, and it takes a few iterations, but same was true for myself when I first learned this stuff. Like this can't be right. This can't be true. This can't be happening, right? Because the entire discipline of economics, and I'm an economist, is built on a completely different foundation. And the foundation is really relying on that personal intuition that all of us have, which is how do I spend my own money? My personal finances. How do I run my business? I have to generate revenues so I can spend. I can borrow a little bit. I can have a little bit of debt up to a certain limit, but then I really have to work hard and tighten the belts and pay the bills. So that's absolutely true for you and I, for states, municipalities, corporations, nonprofits, the users of the currency. But for the federal government, it has to create a deficit on its books so that the rest of us collectively can have that surplus to work with. And as I said, I'll show you the numbers in a little bit just to illustrate. Tadiq, yes.
There's a parallel with local municipalities being able to levy taxes and also to abate taxes in terms of creating tax units. It's a reverse, which is the same sort of structure. They can abate where they want to, and then the concentrated responsibility for whatever positive things happen falls on a smaller group, rather than the moneyed individuals.
There's all kinds of possibilities. I'll sketch a little bit of those ideas, but there's lots of good examples to use. So this is really there's lots of stuff to discuss about MMT. I just want you to hold on to this basic idea that the federal level and the local level issues are different. So at the federal level, do taxes and bond sales fund government spending? The answer is no. If I'm the federal government and I can issue my currency into existence to pay for anything I want, why do I need to borrow money from you? Right? So bond sales, which we call the government is borrowing from us, right? You hear this all the time, that the government doesn't have money, so it's issuing bonds in order to borrow cash to spend. Bond sales, as you'll see in a little bit, don't actually fund government spending at the federal level. Because again, if I can print my own money, why do I need to borrow it from you? Right? It turns out that bond sales play a completely different role. And what we call government deficit, what we call the national debt, have a completely different meaning when we talk about the federal government versus the local state and municipality. So at the local state, at the local municipality level, when the local municipality issues bonds, those bonds actually fund building schools and building hospitals and building things. But at the federal level, the logic is the exact opposite. So bond sales for the debt of the state of Ohio, the debt of a particular municipality, is a real burden that has to be paid. And the only way to do it is through tax revenues. Right? But at the federal level, what we call the national debt is actually the exact equivalent of the net financial assets that the federal government created for the rest of us to use. Right? That's money that hasn't been taxed. That's money that's been created into existence and hasn't been taxed yet. Right? So we have to change the way we think about finances at the local level, at the personal level, versus the federal level. And I know in the back of your mind there's questions about inflation and hyperinflation, all that stuff. I'll come to those questions.
Yeah, I don't want to hold you up too much on this point, but just as a clarifying question, I think it's politically relevant. Does this only apply to like fiat currencies? Right, because in a lot of human history, there's been things like gold standards and silver standards, and there are those on the right who want to go back to that. And it seems like that might follow a slightly different logic.
Absolutely, this is fiat currency. Yeah, if you're limited by quantity of gold or quantity of whatever other commodities, then you've lost part of your sovereignty. As a federal government, you've restricted your sovereignty by agreeing to tie your spending to a particular set of rules. Right? And there's lots of MMT literature about the gold standard and all that stuff. So here we're talking about the U.S. federal government today, which is a fiat currency system. So that's our starting point, the key distinction between the two approaches. So to be more specific, and you're one slide ahead of me here, the definition of what I call monetary sovereignty or financial sovereignty, it's a government that issues its own currency, which is easy for most governments. It's a government that collects taxes denominated in that same currency. So we issue dollars and we collect taxes in dollars. Number three, it's a government that only issues bonds that promise to pay back in US dollars. So when the federal government, when the Treasury sells Treasury bonds, it never promises to pay back in Canadian dollars or gold or any other thing. It's always denominated in the same thing that the Treasury can actually print, right? And then number three, it's a flexible exchange rate system, meaning you don't tie the value of the dollar to another currency or to gold, to anything else. So if you have these four conditions, the federal government has full financial sovereignty. And then the sky's the limit, as I'll explain, under certain rules of managing the system, obviously, in order to prevent inflation and all that. So if you have these conditions, and not all countries enjoy this, and a lot of my work is actually on developing countries that lack some of these conditions, and there are ways or strategies to try to reclaim this monetary sovereignty. But as far as we're concerned today, the U.S. has full financial sovereignty and has plenty of potential to leverage this sovereignty for full employment, for paying for all the things that we talked about earlier today. And here's the data for the United States, and I'll walk you through this bit by bit. So this is the data for the United States from the 1940s to the recent past, 2016, 2017. Notice this is a mirror image. What we have on this axis up here, these are percentages of GDP. We have three sectors in this system. The U.S. government, the federal government, those are the red bars. That's the balance of the government budget, mostly deficits, as you can see. Notice the Bill Clinton surpluses in the 90s, right? The red bars are above zero. But for most U.S. history, like most other countries, actually, governments are always in deficit. The blue bars are the private sector in the U.S. That's households and businesses and firms. That's the private sector balances. Notice the private sector balances are always positive, except for the 1990s, massive consumer debt during these years, and except again for the lead up to the subprime crisis, massive consumer debt also. So the blue bars are in the negative territory. And then the green bars, think of it as the foreign sector, the rest of the world. So we have the US government, US businesses and consumers, and then the rest of the world as one group. So the rest of the world, the green bars, starting in the 1970s all the way to the recent present, the foreign sector has surpluses, trade surpluses with the US, which means the US has a trade deficit with the rest of the world, right? And it adds up. It's a mirror image. If I take this and fold it at the zero axis, it's a perfect mirror image, which takes me back to the statement that I made earlier. A deficit for the federal government is exactly equal to the penny of the surplus of the non-government sector. In this case, non-government meaning domestic U.S. consumers and businesses and the rest of the world. So government on one side, everybody else on the other side. And it always adds up for any country anywhere in the world. This is not a theory. This is actual data. This is accounting description. This is how the numbers add up. So there is no theory about it. This is not really an MMT theory. This is an MMT description of where money comes from and where it goes. Nothing evaporates, nothing disappears. If it leaves the government coffers, it enters somebody else's account, either businesses or consumers or somebody in the rest of the world. Money doesn't just disappear. Right? So this is sort of one of the main pictures that I'd like you to remember about MMT. It just helps us rethink the way things are done today.
To put a word to it, it's transparency.
Transparency.
Transparency in terms of the balance.
Sure. Yeah. So let me illustrate. Let's say I'm running for president, right? And I say, I know how to balance the budget. I balance my checkbook at home, and I used to run an organization or corporation, and I know how to make them profitable and balance their books. Send me to Washington, D.C., and I'll also make sure that the government has a surplus or a balanced budget. In other words, that candidate is saying, send me to D.C., and I'll take these red bars and then move them to zero or move them above zero, right? Make it a government surplus. Which means, by definition, something has to flip to the other side. Either the green bars or the blue bars or a combination of the two, right? The green bars, that's our foreign trade with the rest of the world. We've been deindustrialized since the 1970s. This is not going to flip overnight. It's going to take a long-term industrialization strategy to turn those green bars on the other side. And it's not going to happen anytime soon, I guarantee you. It's going to be the blue bars. So this candidate is saying, vote for me, and I'll make sure that you, the private sector, the blue bars, will go negative. And yet people cheer when they hear candidates saying, yes, finally, we want somebody in DC to balance the budget. Just like you and I balance our books, just like corporations are thorough with their finances and balance their books, the federal government should do the same. Yes.
Would you profile the domestic private sector, the blue area from 2006 to 2014?
This right here?
Yeah. How would you profile
so
the mix in there?
Good question. So the blue bars are firms and households. Households are in deep debt, as I'll show you in a little bit. It's firms that are, as a corporation, you have to be profitable. Right? Some of it is financialization, some of it is speculation. There's all kinds of things built in there. The negative bars here, by the way, this is the entire private sector, but it's mostly households. This is the highest level of household debt that we've achieved in U.S. history. So the rise in here, you have to remember there's quantitative easing. The Fed was pumping money into bank accounts. There's all kinds of things that help the private sector, not households, but corporations, accumulate large surpluses. So this mirror image tool is a very good reminder of what it means when a candidate says, I want to balance the budget. So let's keep this in mind, and there's a lot more to learn about this in MMT. But your basic takeaway, simple equation is that the government balance, the budget of the government, plus the balance of the private sector, plus the balance of the foreign sector, always adds up to zero. This is accounting for any country, any year, anywhere in the world. If it doesn't add up, then there's an accounting mistake. Right? But it always adds up for all countries. In the case of the US today, it means that a government deficit plus a private sector surplus, which is what we have right there in the previous picture, plus the US trade deficit adds up to zero as of right now. This is what it is. So if we want to zoom in on the roots of the problems that progressive economic policies should be looking at, this is what I have, broadly speaking. Structural inequality is, I would put it at the top of the list. Persistent unemployment, this is part of the foundation of capitalism. When Keynes wrote the general theory during the Great Depression, he said the basic faults of capitalism, he identified two. He said inequality, excessive inequality. And Keynes was not a DSA member. He was not a radical. Keynes was a conservative, right? Which most people don't really see Keynesian ideas as conservative today. But Keynes, when he wrote this, he wanted to save capitalism. He wanted to, fight socialism and communism. He said it very clearly. He said if there was a class warfare between the bourgeoisie, the elite, and the labor class, he said, I'll side with my people, the bourgeoisie and the elite. He said, I'm not part of the labor thing. So Keynes, remember, Keynes is a conservative. He's not a radical leftist. But he identified these as the things that can destroy capitalism, the thing that he wanted to preserve and protect: inequality and persistent unemployment, especially large-scale unemployment. And there's a lot of hidden unemployment, obviously, today. And then what comes out of this is the poverty issues, the socioeconomic exclusion, and the injustice, which is multifaceted in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, and so on. So here's where things really started to get ugly in the U.S. economy. Many of you have seen this picture before. This is wages and productivity, essentially. They used to go hand in hand all the way until the early 1970s, and then it really started to accelerate. That gap started to accelerate by the time Reagan and Thatcher and the whole neoliberal movement started to take shape. Which means that the gains from productivity are not going to the working class, they're not going to the middle class, they're going to the top. And that's what starts this massive inequality structure. So, weakening labor unions and, outsourcing jobs and, all the free trade stuff, it's meant to weaken the position of the labor movement, of the working class. And guess what? It worked. So this is the Gini index, which is the inequality index. Not surprising, on the rise, nonstop. This is another way to look at it in terms of families' income. This is adjusted to inflation. The top 5%, substantial increases over the last few decades. The bottom 20%, essentially no increase in real income. Again, adjusted to inflation. This is the official. This is the official unemployment rate. The image is moving, so it will restart again. Notice the darker the color, the higher the unemployment rate by state. And it doesn't really tell you much, right? But the next picture, I'm going to zoom in on youth unemployment by state. And look how ugly the numbers are. Look how much red there is in 2009, 10, and so on. So when we talk about the recovery today, we have to be very careful not to ignore the specifics for youth unemployment, for unemployment by race and ethnicity and gender, which I'll have in the next slide. So the numbers are turning on top. I hope you're seeing the numbers, and it's repeating. The next slide, this is unemployment for white, so white unemployment and black unemployment. The closer to red, the higher the unemployment rate. The white picture on the left-hand side, it doesn't even get any color in it. It's just gray and dark gray. Very low unemployment compared to when you start looking carefully at unemployment rates for minorities. And I am just showcasing this. There's a lot more detail in the data to pay attention to. So the point is that the recovery is not a recovery for everyone.
Just a quick question. How long does it take those communities to recover from those low unemployment or
high unemployment rates? I would ask the question, do they ever recover? If you look at the numbers, minorities in the United States live in a state of a Great Depression permanently, almost, especially for young black men in the United States. And I don't have the specifics data here, but the data is available. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has all these numbers. When we talk about the normal is 20 to 30 to 40% unemployment rates in some communities. That's considered normal. So there is really no recovery. It's just a permanent trap. And this is really what we're trying to address. How can we design structural solutions that can target those particular things? Yes.
Do you have a sense if the map with black unemployment accounts for incarcerated individuals?
No, this is the official unemployment rate. This doesn't even include the hidden unemployment.
So in fact, it would be much higher.
Much higher, absolutely. So a better measure of unemployment, which is also from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is what we call the underemployment rate. But this is underemployment in the economic sense of the term, not the colloquial sense of the term. Most of us, when we hear underemployment, we refer to somebody who has like a master's degree in engineering and is working at McDonald's, meaning employed in lower skill sets type of occupation. That's what we call underemployment in colloquial conversations. But this underemployment means those who are officially counted as unemployed by the BLS, plus those who are working part-time involuntarily, not by choice, because they couldn't find anything full-time, plus those who are considered discouraged workers, those who looked and looked and looked and looked for a long time and then gave up looking. The BLS actually keeps track of those who gave up looking. They keep track of them for up to a year, and then they're officially out of the labor force. Those who gave up looking obviously are not considered officially unemployed. So this measure counts those groups. And there are so many other categories, by the way, of people who are unemployed. You and I would call them unemployed, but they're not officially counted. Like people unemployed because of lack of transportation, or because they have to take care of an elderly parent, or because they can't afford childcare and somebody has to stay home. There's all of these categories of people who are displaced, pushed out of the labor force, excluded, not because they don't want to work, because they can only find miserable jobs that don't pay enough to have them, hire somebody to take care of an elderly parent or take care of kids at home. Childcare is not as a luxury; it's becoming a luxury. Right? So this measure at least captures some of that. It doesn't include all the categories. It just includes the officially unemployed, those who are discouraged workers, and the involuntary part-time workers, which is becoming a significant category in the last 10 years. It used to be a small group. Now it's in the millions. And as of today, this measure gives us double the official unemployment rate. The official unemployment rate is 3 point something, or a little bit less than 4%. Right now, this measure is giving us 8%. So it's just a better lens of assessing the extent of the problem. Not ideal, but at least it shows us that the problem is twice the size, at least. Now, this picture, I want to pause with this and really have you digest it and take pictures of it and share it with your friends and do whatever you want. This is when we talk about the recovery and who gains from the recovery. So every time we hit a recession and then we recover, the gains from the recovery used to go primarily to the bottom 90% of the population. That's the blue bars. So the gains from the recovery in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way to, the early, here, you can see the trend. Most of the gains are going to the top 10%. And in the last two iterations, the last 2 decades, especially the last one, this is post-2008, the gains of the recovery went all the way to the top 10%. And the bottom 90% of the population are actually losing. There is no recovery for the bottom 90%. Why? Because the jobs that have been created are jobs with lower wages, lower benefits, more precarious, no, Uberization of the economy. Everybody works part-time, right? Everybody hustles to make a living. And this is not a theory. These are the numbers. These are the facts. There's something fundamentally wrong with this direction, right? So this has to be addressed from a structural standpoint. A little bit of reform on the edges of the problem is not going to address this. We're heading towards the cliff, right? And it's not just a handful of us. It's the whole system, right? 90% of the population is losing from what we call successful recovery, right? So this is depressing. And this, by the way, this chart is from a colleague of mine, Pavlina Cherneva, who's one of the leading scholars in the MMT and job guarantee community. So I decided to look up data for Franklin County, since we're here in Franklin County today. MIT, the geography department, not the economics department, has an excellent database for every single county in the country that looks up the cost of living in every community, in every county, and compares it to the minimum wage. And the picture is a little bit small here, but I'll provide the PowerPoint later. It gives you the breakdown for the minimum wage compared to a living wage for a family of 2, family of 3, with kids, without kids, parents working, not working, and it just doesn't add up, right? If you're earning minimum wage, working full time, you can't. The living wage is much, much higher, and this is part of the problem. We haven't increased the minimum wage, substantially in decades. And it's always, small incremental increases every 10 years or so. It just doesn't add up. So I'll give you an example here. I know some of you sitting in the back can't read this. But essentially for 2 adults, 1 working and 1 child, the living wage in Franklin County should be $20.88. Now, that's not the minimum wage that people earn here, right? The next slide breaks down the cost of living in, yes, please.
Sorry, what is poverty wage?
Poverty wage, which means, you're below the poverty line if you earn that.
Oh, okay.
Right.
That's what minimum wage is.
No, minimum wage doesn't keep you alive. Right. And by the way, this gap between a living wage and what people actually earn sets up, an ideal territory for predatory lending to take place. And guess what? Ohio is the #1 state in the country in terms of predatory lending, in terms of payday lending and all of this. I could talk about it a little bit later, but it's mind-boggling that we have more payday lending stores in Ohio than McDonald's. Not that we want more McDonald's than payday lending, but both are bad. Just to give you the visual, right? And there's legislation that's being discussed actually as we speak. There's a core group of activists from across the state who have been pushing for HB 123, which is supposed to take care of most of the loopholes in the predatory lending business in the state of Ohio. And the petition, failed on technicalities a couple of weeks ago. And instead, the conservative legislators in the state of Ohio, just a couple of days ago, came up with their own, proposal to take care of payday lending and predatory lending. And it doesn't do anything. It's just, a way for them to save face, to say, look, we're doing something about it, but it's really nothing. So keep an eye open for what's happening in Columbus the next few days. So this is the cost of living. And, some of the issues we mentioned earlier, childcare is the most expensive item, across the country. I've looked at so many counties, data for so many counties. Childcare is a significant cost. Medical care, so the importance of having a universal healthcare system. It's a huge burden on families. So again, I'll share the data with you, and you can easily Google it. It's MIT Living Wage Database. It's called Living Wage Calculator, and you can look it up by state for every county in the country, and invite your friends to look it up and see if their experience living in a particular county actually reflects these numbers. And I've done it with so many people, and they say, yeah, that's about right. So this is not going to go away without raising the wage, the minimum wage, and working on a federal minimum wage increases, but also at the state and local level. There's nothing, to prevent a state or a city from offering a higher living wage. So now I want to talk a little bit about the job guarantee program at the federal government, at the federal level. This is not local, right? So the federal government has the authority, has the capacity to essentially pay for anything it wants. So by spending, it puts money in the system. By taxing, it takes money out of the system, right? And by selling bonds, the federal government also takes money out of the system. So it turns out that selling bonds is not to fund government spending. Selling bonds is actually to take money out of circulation, to reduce the pressure on inflation. Because if there's too much money in the system and not enough productive capacity, people have too much cash, they go on a shopping spree, prices go up. That's what inflation is. So one way to tame that is either by taxing the hell out of the population and taking money out, or doing it in a more friendly way by selling bonds to rich people, paying them interest to take that purchasing power out of circulation. And that's what we call the national debt, right? It's not the same thing as my personal debt or your personal debt. So it turns out that the federal government has a very effective way of spending on anything at once without having to cause inflation or hyperinflation. What matters at the end of the day in terms of inflation and hyperinflation is the productive capacity of the economy. If we're spending money on wasteful things, like literally not increasing productive capacity, paying people to buy food, but there are no farmers to produce food, what do you think is going to happen? Demand for food is going to go up because everybody has cash and wants food. Demand is high, but nobody's producing food. What's going to happen to the price? It's going to skyrocket. And the last thing you want to do in a situation like that, which is what happened in Venezuela, which happened in Zimbabwe, by the way, it's exactly this. The government paying people, redistributed the land to, people who worked for the government during the independence movement. They were soldiers, they were not farmers. The government decided to take away land from productive farmers and give it to people who are not farmers. And all of a sudden, the production of food dropped by 50%, but the demand for food is still the same. So the price goes up. So then the government does the second mistake, which is in order to allow people to afford the more expensive food, the government printed more money to pay them higher wages, to chase more food that doesn't exist. And that's how the spiral, the inflation spiral starts. That inflation spiral will not end until you actually have enough food for everybody to buy. That's how you tame prices. So it's very important not just take that capacity to print money and go crazy with it. You have to direct the spending in areas that actually improve productive capacity, produce more food, If we decide we want to offer free healthcare for everybody, let's start with a simple example. Free dental care for everybody today. And we have, let's say, 500,000 dentists and hygienists in the country with their tools and equipment and all that. But then everybody wants to set up an appointment because now it's free. It's covered by the federal government. If we don't have enough dentists to actually meet the demand, you can have all the money in the world. It's not going to solve the problem that when you pick up the phone and schedule, say, yeah, we'll see you in 3 years. Because it's booked up. Our capacity to provide that service is low. So instead of doing that, what you want to do is, before you announce we want to have a free dental care for everybody, is to start sending kids to school and funding them to go to dental school so that you increase the productive capacity of those services, and fund R&D so that you build more hospitals, you build more equipment, you provide the actual physical resources that will give us the free healthcare. Instead, we say we can't afford that because that's too expensive to send everybody to medical school for free and more dentists, right? Because we're thinking backwards. Right? So for our progressive friends who want universal healthcare and universal this and universal that, we have to pay attention to the productive capacity and aim our policies to producing that productive capacity so that there is no inflation. Because if we have a limited number of dentists and lots of demand, what do you think is going to happen to the price? The cost is going to go up. Because if you want to get ahead in the schedule, you pay more. There's private practice, there's this, and there's private insurance, and this is covered and this is not covered. That's what's going to keep the cost rising. Right? But if we have the additional productive capacity, then we can afford to pay for it, and it's not going to be expensive. It's not going to be inflationary. So it's very important to keep these things in mind. So that's in terms of the capacity of the federal government to do things. But then there is the capacity for the government to use the existing economic machine and crank it up a little faster, which I don't recommend, versus transforming the machine itself. The existing machine, you've seen the results. You crank it up faster, it produces more inequality, it produces more poverty, it produces more of the same, right? Because the jobs will go to the most competitive, the most skilled, and those who are left behind will be left behind. Right? So there is room for the government to fund large-scale infrastructure projects, and those are important. But then how do we deal with the local pockets of poverty and deindustrialization and all kinds of localized economic and social problems? Those have to be dealt with at the local level in a decentralized way. So the job guarantee program that I propose and many of my colleagues support is a sort of a two-tier job guarantee. One is the big, large-scale infrastructure, which is needed. We need better infrastructure, green infrastructure, education, healthcare, all of those things at the macro national level. But then we have to have targeted programs that are managed by local nonprofits, local organizations, local municipalities, because they have to be tailor-made to the needs of the local community. And a bureaucrat sitting in Washington, D.C. is not going to know what every community needs. So we have the sketch of the infrastructure is already there. We have nonprofits across the country that are doing already a lot of this work, but they tend to be underfunded, understaffed, and their funding goes away during the time periods when it's needed the most, during bad economic times when there is no funding from the federal government, there is no charitable donations because everybody's losing money in the stock market or whatever. That's when the unemployment is the highest. That's when the social issues are at their peak. And that's when they're mostly understaffed and underfunded. So how are they typically funded? Grants from local states and municipalities, from foundations, and some federal grants too go to some local nonprofits and nationwide nonprofits that have local chapters. The infrastructure is there. What we're saying is crank it up, right? Increase the funding to the local nonprofits. So if you ask any local nonprofit and tell them, you know the needs of the community, you know the local problems, you're already trying to address them, but you're understaffed and underfunded. If there is an opportunity to apply for a grant from the federal government to pay for 2 additional staff members, would you be able to handle it? Would you be able to do it? The answer is always yes, because there's plenty to do, right? We just don't have the resources to do it. So the idea here is to use the fabric of the infrastructure that we already have, the local nonprofits. They know the needs of the community. They can make a long list of the priorities of the community. You can do it in a participatory way, participatory budgeting, participatory auditing, participatory everything. And that's what democracy was supposed to be. That's why I always say participatory democracy, to remind everybody that democracy by itself is really not what we're experiencing, what we aspire for, because whatever the system that we have today is really not what it was meant to be. So we have to add that qualifier of participatory in every step of the way. So if we have that local infrastructure, then you can think of the local nonprofits making a list of the local priorities, the spending priorities, the projects that need to be addressed at the local community, and then a list of the local unemployed population with their skill levels, and then it becomes a matchmaking exercise, matching the skills of the local population to work on the needs of the local community. And if the skills don't match, there's room for on-the-job training. There's room for education and training and improving those skills. But we can't just sit there and say the skills are not there, the needs are here, we don't have money, so there's nothing we can do about it. Right? There is no alternative. This is the famous Thatcher story. Tariq.
The Achilles heel is the historic low literacy rate of economic and financial literacy of nonprofits.
And that's why we're doing this education. That's why we're here today.
So emphasizing that.
Sure, yeah, and it's true across the board. It's not just nonprofits. It's federal government, elected officials too. So here's I'm not putting anything on the slides because I want to describe the mechanics first and then go through the slides quickly. Here is the best way to think of the job guarantee program and what it does at the macro level, at the structural level, because we do actually have these programs in place right now for a long time. Most countries do have these mechanisms. It's called the buffer stock mechanism, meaning it operates as a buffer to stabilize things. So we have a buffer stock for corn, a buffer stock for wheat, for basic commodities. Why? Because the federal government in the US and other countries finds it extremely important to stabilize prices for corn and wheat and coffee and all kinds of basic commodities, so that consumers don't suffer too much inflation in terms of food inflation. So think about it this way. If there is a drought and corn production drops significantly, there is a shortage of corn, what happens to the price of corn? It's going to skyrocket, it's going to cause food price inflation, it's going to hurt consumers. On the other hand, if there is a massive surplus of corn production, because farmers are too productive, what's going to happen to the price? It drops to zero, right? And that's why we have programs in the US and other countries to pay farmers not to produce too much, right? I mean, back in the old day, countries used to buy all the surplus of food that shouldn't be, in circulation in the economy because prices otherwise will drop to zero. Brazil used to take, shiploads of coffee and dump it in the ocean. Russia used to take shiploads of wheat and dump it in the ocean because it was just too much, right? And if they allowed farmers to sell it in the marketplace, the price will go to zero and it will destroy the farming sector. So instead of having these wild fluctuations of food inflation and then prices going to zero, governments have these mechanisms, they're called buffer stock mechanism, where the government steps in and becomes the buyer of last resort of all the surplus, takes it and stores it away, right? And actually in the US, in large caves, they call them, huge warehouses, where corn and wheat and other basic commodities, non-perishables, are stored away for the future in case there's a drought or there's a natural disaster or there's a war or there's whatever. So when there's plenty of surplus, the government buys it and stores it away to keep the price profitable enough for farmers. But when there's a shortage in the marketplace, the government steps in and sells that surplus back into the economy to prevent prices from skyrocketing. So the government keeps the buffer within that reasonable range so that prices are not too low for farmers to go bankrupt, but not too high for consumers to experience significant inflation. Anything in between, we call it market fluctuations, but the government actually controls the boundaries systematically. We do this in the US, Australia does the same, Canada does the same, every major country does it for the sake of stabilizing the prices of key commodities to prevent inflation and price fluctuations.
After, for the example, where the US was all of a sudden dumping reserve agricultural products in Mexico,
sure, yeah.
forcing the campesinos off their land.
Right. So if we understand the mechanism, we have to realize that governments recognize the importance of these commodities. They're the most important commodities according to these governments. We should disagree that yes, these commodities are important and stabilizing their prices is important, but the most important quote unquote commodity that its price should be stabilized is labor. Right? What is the minimum, the effective wage in the economy, the minimum effective wage, not the legal minimum wage. If you're working, your minimum wage is the minimum wage, legally, right? But if you're not working, if you're unemployed, your effective wage is zero. So we allow the price of labor to go to zero, but not the price of wheat and corn and coffee and all kinds of other commodities. So what we're saying here is introduce the same mechanism, have the government step in as the buyer of last resort of those labor, of those labor hours, labor power. And then the government can step in as the seller of last resort, right? When there is, shortage of labor in the economy. But instead of taking labor and storing it away in a warehouse like we do for coffee and corn and wheat, we use labor in a productive capacity to engage in these local community development programs, because you're preserving skills, improving skills, and serving needs of the communities in areas that are underserved by the private sector or by the traditional government sector.
Is this fundamentally different from the New Deal public works programs, or is it the same sort of thing?
Similar, except that what I'm proposing here is a permanent buffer stock. Right? The New Deal was a temporary program. Right? Every country on earth has some sort of New Dealish type of program that was introduced during bad economic times, but then it was immediately canceled afterwards because people thought we can't afford it. Why can we afford to have everybody doing useful things all the time? That's what we're saying here. Having a buffer stock for corn temporarily doesn't work. It has to be permanent to do its job, which is stabilizing prices of corn. You can't just implement it for 3 years and say, now prices are stable, so let's get rid of the buffer stock. It has to be permanent in order for it to work. And, we have all kinds of government interventions to stabilize prices. We do that for the stock market. We do that for the bond market. You don't let the stock market crash all the way to zero. There's all kinds of policies you put in place to make sure that you don't have an excessive bubble of too much speculation in the stock market, but also you don't let the market crash all the way to zero. That's what the Fed does. And we consider it the most important agency in the economy. This is what we need to add. Another very important agency in the economy that stabilizes the wage for workers at a decent living wage. It doesn't have to be the miserable minimum wage that we've seen today. And then use that pool of workers in creative local community development ways, so that you're not going to hire local workers to compete with GM and GE. They already do that, so let them do it. It's really looking at the local problems, which is lack of resources for nonprofits, for after-school programs, for community development, for environmental cleanup, all the things that are completely ignored by the private sector because they're not profitable, because there's no money in that thing, because it serves people who don't have money. Right? And here we're saying local organizations can take over local communities. The funding comes from the central authority, the selection of the projects, the implementation, the auditing, all the things, the checks and balances can be done in the same way. And I'm talking about organizations that have national reputation, that are being audited by the IRS on a regular basis. They file for taxes and I'm talking about, the main national nonprofits, but it could be also small or local nonprofits that have the right IRS paperwork and have the right checks and balances and auditing and everything. So this is what we call participatory budgeting, participatory planning, participatory everything to address the problems at the local level. So this is kind of sketching the job guarantee. There's much more to it, obviously. But I'm going to skip over what I just described because you'll get a chance to read it later. And then I'm going to just put on the board just a few examples of what kinds of jobs. And there's a long list. I have like 2 or 3 slides of these. I'll just keep them on the screen so that you can take a look at this. And this is the importance of having this decentralized. You can't really come up with a list. I mean, this is an attempt at coming up with a list. But every community will have different needs, will have different organizations, will have different skills. And the idea here is to take workers as they are, where they are at the local level, and do on-the-job training, and do, whatever improvement in skills you do is always going to be to the benefit of the community, even to the benefit of the private sector. Because you have to realize, the current system, when we go through a recession, you have mass unemployment, you have people with no income to spend, no purchasing power. And that's what drives us into a vicious cycle of a recession, because business sales go down, their revenues go down, so they lay off even more workers. Here, what we're saying, we have this automatic stabilizer, so that every time somebody is losing his or her job in the private sector, they have a safety net of a job that pays a living wage, working in local community development, to preserve their skills, professional skills, improve their skills, learn new skills, and have purchasing power to keep buying goods and services, to afford education and transportation and entertainment and food and everything else. So, of course, when you have a program of this kind that guarantees that income through work and guarantees the preservation of skills and training, then you don't have to have all the other, Band-Aid solutions, which is let people live in poverty and starvation and then give them food stamps, right? Or pay for, all the negative consequences of unemployment. Tons of studies in the US and other countries, social science studies showing that every time unemployment goes up, there's an increase in crime, domestic violence, child abuse, divorce, mental conditions, suicide, and the cost of these things, the opioid addiction, the cost of these things is substantial. If we start accounting for these things, and then we compare what the job guarantee actually costs, which I'll show you in a minute, it's a no-brainer. Why would you spend all of that money and have society go through all that pain when the solution is right there on the table, and it's much, much cheaper? Even if you don't understand MMT, it makes common sense to spend in a preventative way as opposed to spend on Band-Aid solutions afterwards. And Band-Aid solutions don't fix the problem. They actually constitute that mechanism that keeps that same engine that produces inequality and poverty and all that. So this is really what I have in mind today. And I have a longer list here on the second slide. The issue of inflation, hyperinflation, I just described the case of Zimbabwe. The US has plenty of productive capacity. We actually have close to 25-30% idle productive capacity. Plenty of room for employment, for putting in place a job guarantee program, because the job guarantee program is not going to compete with GM and GE and industrial, and other businesses. It's going to complement what the private sector is doing and focus on the care economy, on the quality of life economy, right? Especially in the pockets within the country where there's a lot of deficiency in terms of providing basic services for decent quality of life. All right. Can we afford it? Here are some of the numbers. So let's say I just played around with these numbers. Yeah, the previous one was from the Obama days. So I ran some numbers just for the sake of argument. If we say, depending on the level of skill, some people get paid $15, some people get paid $18, some people pay $21. Just for the sake of argument, just to see how much this will cost. And included, benefits in the program, included the cost of the material costs for running the program, and the numbers are here. So assuming we get 23 million people to employ in this program, full-time, 40 hours a week, assuming a benefits package of $10,000, roughly speaking, material cost of $50 billion, it turns out that the net cost of this job guarantee program for 23 million people is less than $600 billion. It's less than 4% of GDP in the US. And this eliminates the problems at the roots, right? And eliminates also some of the hidden problems. And this is at the peak. These numbers, by the way, are at the peak of the 2008 crisis, the highest level of unemployment and hidden unemployment. The thing about the job guarantee, it operates as a buffer stock because you absorb all the unemployed and you give them purchasing power, so they go out and buy things. And that drives up revenues and profits for the private sector, drives up demand, so they start wanting to hire more people. They hire them away from the job guarantee program, so it shrinks the size of the program. So the job guarantee program will be the largest during the worst recession. And then it will start to shrink automatically because you're giving people purchasing power, they go out and shop, businesses want to hire more, they hire them away from that job guarantee program. But it stays as a permanent buffer, it fluctuates back and forth. But it's a safety net so that when the private sector hits the next recession, people are not left behind. People are, put back into a community development program at the local level. They don't have to move across the country. They don't have to borrow money. They don't have to go to predatory lenders. They remain in their community, work in their own community, and quickly move back into the private sector if necessary. So this, post-2008 recovery cost is already in the trillions. Lots of estimates about how much we spent, and we didn't even put a dent in unemployment until very recently. And even when we did, it's really the official numbers, not the hidden numbers. Plus all the pain that society is still suffering from in terms of inequality and injustice. And that's what I mean, having a program that addresses the structural root causes as opposed to Band-Aid solutions that don't even work. Yes.
How much are the Band-Aid solutions cost?
It depends on what you want to account for. So you can go through the details and count for food stamps, count the prison cost, count the opioid addiction cost, which there was a study that came out a few weeks ago that estimated it's $1 trillion a year, nationwide. How much do we spend on building new prisons versus how much do we spend, funding after-school programs and music lessons and sports programs and summer camps, right? Yeah, summer camps are expensive, but they're not as expensive as building prisons. And financial costs, and also in terms of emotional and quality of life costs for society, right? So these are, and we can be as generous as we want in terms of being conservative and estimating these numbers. My numbers here estimate, a small, very conservative portion of reducing the costs in terms of prisons, reducing the costs in terms of welfare spending. Because once you have a job guarantee, there'll be a minimal need for food stamps and assistance because the job guarantee doesn't force everybody to work. It says if you're ready, willing, and able to work, there will be a job in a local community organization. But there will be people who can't work for health reasons, for family reasons, or whatever. So those people will still need a basic income assistance, right? So job guarantee includes a basic income component for those who can't work or unable to work for whatever reason. So we can estimate this in every way you want. My estimates here are the most conservative. I try to be as generous as possible with the wages and as conservative as possible in terms of the cost savings. Right? I didn't include the opioid addiction. I didn't include all the prison costs and all of that. I just took a few small numbers for the heck of it. Let's see how much it costs. And it's still very affordable.
And then there's TARP.
And then there's all the bailout money and all the TARP and all the subsidies.
Right. Around,
right.
$30 trillion.
Yeah. If we try to take into account every single negative spending that we do that goes directly, that comes out of the consequences of unemployment and poverty and all that, it's a no-brainer. It's the program more than pays for itself, beyond any limit. So I had the wages here. Sorry, I copied the slides twice, I think. All right, so what can we do at the local level? Right, and I'll stop in a few minutes. What can be done locally if the federal government is not listening, if they're not going to do anything in terms of using their sovereign capacity to fund the job guarantee program? What can we do at the local level here in Columbus or any other place? At the state level, ideally, at the city level, it's doable. At the local municipality level, it becomes more difficult just because the size of the market, the size of the economy gets really small. But there is still potential. There's still potential. So let's work on the state level, city level, especially a city like Columbus or Cleveland or Dayton. These things are possible given the size of the market, the size of the population. Again, philosophically, it has to be a forward-looking spending philosophy, meaning spend on after-school programs instead of spending on prisons. Right? Change this philosophy that we have. I mean, even progressives are falling into the trap of this school-to-prison pipeline because we have this mentality of crime and punishment, right? Of security, especially national security. Let's not fall into that trap. It's important to have a long-term vision. We're not saying we'll never have prisons ever, we'll never have crime ever, that if we eliminate unemployment, all crime will disappear. That's not the case. But there's quite a bit that can be eliminated if we address some of these structural issues, especially in the education system and the after-school and the family care system is extremely important. The public bank solution, as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of interest in different states and different cities across the country. The idea here is to, use the financial power of the state. I mean, the state of Ohio collects quite a bit of taxes on a regular basis. It has quite a bit of a rainy day fund that's sitting there in reserves, earning very little interest from Wall Street banks. Why not use those resources at the local level? So there's different visions for what a state bank would look like and different proposals. But the idea is to cut the middleman in terms of funding local infrastructure projects. So instead of raising funds through Goldman Sachs or Bank of America to issue bonds to fund the local school construction or the local stadium construction or local, water treatment plant, doing it at the local level through a state bank will cut the cost substantially in terms of the interest payments. And then whatever interest the bank is earning, whatever revenues the bank is earning, it's owned by the residents of the state. It's part of the base for the city or for the state. So nothing is leaking out of the system, so to speak. But think of every time we build a new piece of infrastructure, think of the interest payment that we're paying at the local level as taxpayers is leaking to compensation for CEOs across the country, for bonuses, and for shareholders who are sucking wealth out of the local community. A state bank will cut that cost substantially. And again, philosophically, that's the idea, but in terms of the legal setting, it can vary. So you can have it completely owned by the public. You can have shareholders who contribute to setting up the bank, but without having voting rights, right? So there's all kinds of mechanisms of setting up the bank initially. And a lot of this is actually being designed as we speak by different people who are working on this. But having the vision that this is serving the local community at a much lower cost than external financing. And guess what? There will be people who will not like the idea. You can guess who. People who get this business, right? If you have the state of Ohio competing with Goldman Sachs or the state of California, which would be one of the biggest potentially public banks, competing with major banks with a rainy day fund of $70-80 billion in California, that's a major bank, right? And it can have a lot of firepower in terms of local community development. So at the state level, it's ideal, but at the city level, it's also possible. It reduces speculative finance. There's all kinds of benefits for this, and I don't invite you to investigate a little bit of the different models that are out there. The Public Banking Institute in California has quite a bit of resources on this, and then there's quite a few of us across the country, including here in Ohio, who are brainstorming the ideal design that would work for us here in Ohio. Complementary currency, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, because there's lots of local currencies across the country, across the world. But they don't really fit that description that I had earlier about money being something driven by taxes. Like at the federal level, government issues money into existence and then taxes it back, accepts it in payment of taxes. So borrowing that concept of sovereignty and implementing it at the local level would look something like this. So let's say the city of Columbus decides to start paying its employees, government employees, city employees, say 95% of their wages in US dollars, and then another 5%, and these things that my friend calls TANs, tax anticipation notes. They can be electronic things, they can be paper bills that look like money, but let's say 95% is paid in US dollars, and 5% is paid in this local currency, complementary currency, that the municipality issues. So then the employees will say, what can we do with these things that you just printed, in the state office, in the municipal office? Say, well, you can use those things to pay your utility bills. You can use those things in pre-designated businesses that have agreed to accept these in payments one-to-one as a US dollar. But then why would any business accept these funny-looking things in payment for goods and services that they produced? Well, because the city have made an agreement with them that they can also use those notes to pay their utility bills or to pay their local city municipal taxes to the issuer. So you, the issuer, the municipality, you issue it in payments, and then you accept it back in payment to yourself, right? Even better, if we have a locally owned cooperative or state-owned or city-owned wind farm or solar farm, and assuming for the sake of argument that we paid for the fixed cost of setting up the wind farm, and now it's producing electricity literally out of thin air, literally out of sunshine, minus the management cost of, the maintenance cost of the wind farm, of the solar farm. Then you can allow people who are holding these notes to pay their utility bills to the local renewable energy company in those notes, because this is really out of thin air. Right? But what you're doing is that you're expanding the purchasing power of the community. And you can start targeting where the spending goes. If I'm a municipal judge and somebody has a speeding ticket, they pay $100 and some dollars, $130. You can say, well, we'll accept payment and taxes in US dollars or in the local currency. So then how do I get hold of these local currency things? Well, I'm going to have to, trade it, buy it from somebody else. So you can start designating some of these funds to local community development organizations that, receive funds from somebody like me who has a speeding ticket. I can go to the local nonprofit and buy $130 worth of, these TANs to pay my fine to the city, to the municipality. And you can start expanding this, beyond what I just described. But you can start thinking of creating local currency that actually has real economic multiplier effects. Ideally, the federal government should do this, right? But here we're borrowing from the idea of the federal government issuing currency and being willing to accept it in taxes, in payment of taxes to itself at the state level, at the city level. Even better if the state of Ohio does this, right? Because then you have a much larger market. Even better if every state does this. And then even better if every state agrees to make it a one system, then it's a federal system, right? And then we're building up to the federal sovereignty. Right? But we can start showing the way at the local level by piloting a city level or a state level experiment of local currency. So this TAN, tax anticipation notes proposal, was originally circulated by a small group of MMT economists, including a friend of mine, Rob Parento, which some of you have met when he visited a few years ago here in Ohio. He proposed this in the context of the Greek debt crisis, where, because of the rules of the Eurozone, Greece is not allowed to print its own currency. They can't pay their employees. They can't pay their pensions or retirements or anything. And it was chaos in the streets. So he proposed this. Why not, don't print euros, because Greece is not allowed to print euros, but issue these electronic units. He even proposed it to be like a mobile currency system that, now the government of Greece can pay its employees 80% in euros and 20% in these units, and jumpstart the economy in a different way, right? Because if you're in that downward spiral of a depression, of economic depression, and there's no stopping it, you have to somehow jumpstart the economy to stop the bleeding, to start building the economy again, and this allows us to do that. In our context here in Ohio or any other city, you can think of this complementary currency system, but it has to come from a tax authority at the municipal level, at the state level. It has to be a taxing authority, or it has to be ideally a taxing authority attached to major utilities, right? Or major utilities that agree to pay their taxes to the city in that same currency, or at least a portion of their taxes in that currency. So we can scale it, on a mini scale, on a larger scale, at the city level, at the state level. But there are solutions to showcase that we can address root causes without having to raise taxes, without having to beg for money from the federal government. Yes,
so have you guys done any instances or any research been done into any instances of this actually working real time, or any simulated data to show kind of what this would look like?
We're working on this, right? The only examples of local currencies that you'll find are local currencies that are kind of voluntary participation, like a time bank currency, there's literally thousands of examples of local currencies across the country, but they're not tied to a taxing authority. You have to sort of opt into participation. So Ithaca dollars, for example, which is the one of the famous ones. Ithaca dollars, you can think of it as a local club where people decide to participate and get discounts if they do business with local stores. It's still important, it's still valuable, because it stops that leaky bucket situation where somebody, earns US dollars working in Ithaca, and then they go on the weekend to New York City and spend their money there, right? So that's money leaving the system. With Ithaca dollars, you can only spend them in Ithaca, so you're keeping local businesses thriving. This will do the same, because this local currency will only be accepted within that larger club that we want to build in Ohio or in the city of Columbus. And it will keep businesses thriving locally. The more money circulates, the more businesses participate. But now with the added benefit of having the state or the municipality, backing it with its taxing power, right? And having large utilities, ideally solar and wind farms, that back it up in terms of being willing to accept payments for bills, utility bills. And you can target this to lower income groups. You can target this to students. You can target this to the design. In terms of designing this, the sky's the limit. The creativity is that we can put on the table is what determines how this can be structured. But we have to stop saying that there is no alternative. There is no solution, right? And we have to think beyond, taxing the rich. If we can't tax the rich, then nothing can be done, right? So even Bernie Sanders fell into that trap of the billionaires and the 1% of the 1%. If we tax them, everything will be fine. Maybe, yeah. I mean, we should tax them for the sake of taxing them, but not for the sake of funding programs that we can fund in different ways. Right? So there's room for taxing the rich. Don't get me wrong, but we shouldn't hold the rest of society hostage unless we were able to tax the rich.
The biggest example I'm aware of is the land sovereign wealth fund who sponsored a currency program there. So it's essentially for all indigenous people and friends that they've set up essentially a bank account process. So it's that scale that you're talking about.
Sure. Chuck?
What do you think about Venezuela's petrol currency? I don't know if you've heard that.
Yeah.
This sounds very similar.
No, it's not similar.
Well, I mean, you were just talking about utilities and stuff. So,
yeah,
just in the background, it's where people use this currency to purchase Venezuelan oil.
It's sort of reinventing some sort of gold standard backed by oil instead of gold. It's a waste of time. It's a nonsense. Oil is there. You know, if there's shortage of food in Venezuela, there's going to be shortage of food, whether you call it petro or they call it, you know, dollars or oil barrels. Their problems are, you know, I wish I had another hour. We can do developing countries and talk about Venezuela, but their problems are beyond this. If you guys don't mind, just a couple of bullet points to conclude, and then we'll open up to questions. So my point here is that the unemployment, inequality, poverty situation is you know, calling for bold and urgent actions. The current policies that we have are too weak, expensive, and ineffective. And the economic justice via living wage jobs program is possible, desirable, affordable, and that's really what we should, you know, dedicate our attention to. And, thank you again for listening and for being here. And if the federal government is not going to do it, we should start at least at the local level. So I'll stop here and I'll take questions from the audience. And then Steve is also with us online. They may have questions online too.
So I really like the idea of taking the sort of buffer stock idea and moving it to the labor commodity, right? But my question regarding the way that you talked about the job guarantee program, which is probably a question you get a lot, is with this, the sort of jobs that you're proposing are better than jobs that most people have, right?
Yes.
In a variety of ways.
Yeah, we should aim for better.
I agree. So if you're in a situation where you could work for a cultural center for $15 an hour, right? Private corporations will need to increase their wages to match the disutility of the labor, right? Walmart's going to have to pay people $17 an hour, and then they can either raise their prices or pay their executives less. Sure. We know which one they're going to choose, right? You had mentioned earlier that you think that inflation is more about productive capacity, but I'm curious how you end up in a situation where the wages that you're paying for these jobs that people want, right, end up being sufficient when then people who work in jobs that you would rather not have to then rise.
Absolutely. So one of the things that the buffer stock will do is to set the minimum acceptable by society, or whether it's 15 or 16 or whatever it is, that becomes the effective minimum wage that everybody else in the private sector will have to compete with. So of course I'm going to prefer working in a community, you know, center, you know, doing the things that I enjoy in a fulfilling and appreciated type of work environment, as opposed to flipping burgers or you know, working for, you know, a precarious job. So then the corporations that really need the workers, because at the end of the day, Walmart needs its staff, right? If they have no other choice, they will have to hire people at that wage. Then it becomes, we're back to the very first slide of that wages and productivity gap, and we reconsider the path that we set for ourselves back in the 70s and 80s, where we allowed, by design, by legal action by Congress, by design, we allowed corporations to extract most of the gains from productivity. So what I'm proposing will upset that relationship, and it's going to open up the space for a larger public discourse about how we as a society organize the system, and including the role of the labor movement, including the role of regulation in terms of setting standards. Because it's not going to be just the wage. It's going to be the wage and benefits and workplace environment and everything else. They have to compete for what we as a society decide is the minimal acceptable work environment, wage, benefits, and everything else.
So there would also have to be some sort of price control, or are you suggesting that like some sort of labor mechanism could also affect that?
Well, here's the thing that it's important to highlight here. When we think of wages going up, we also tend to think of it from an individual micro perspective. If I run a small family business and I have to pay higher wages, you know, my revenue being the same, my profits might go down. I might actually go out of business if I'm forced to pay a higher wage. That's for individuals. But if we do this across the board, nationwide, then you have all wages going up. And all wages, as Mikhail Kaletsky, who's a famous economist in the 30s, said, that workers spend what they get, and capitalists get what they spend. Meaning workers, you know, you pay them a little bit higher wage, they go on a shopping spree, quote unquote. They spend it. Where does it go? It goes to, where do Walmart workers spend their wages? At Walmart. So in other places, but sometimes it's all spent at Walmart. So wages go up, sales go up, revenues go up, profits go up for the corporate sector. And this is at the macro level. There might be businesses going up and down and things like that. But structurally, for the system as a whole, it actually benefits the corporate sector. The job guarantee program does actually benefit the corporate sector in terms of sales and revenues and profits, but also in terms of bargaining position. Because think about the current system that we have. And this is bargaining position with workers, right? Because right now we use the threat of unemployment as the scary, device to say, if you're not productive, if you don't accept these wages, if you don't accept these conditions, you'll be unemployed. You'll be in a much worse situation. So you have to, shut up and work, right? Now, what's a more of an actual threat to your employment position? Somebody who's been unemployed for 2 years with no skills and living in that situation, or somebody who's working in a community development organization with preserved skills, even more developed professional skills. He or she is more employable. So that's more of a threat to me than somebody who's been unemployed for 2 years. Ask any employer, tell them, would you rather hire somebody who's been unemployed or hire somebody who's already working in some other business? So of course I want to hire somebody who's already working because they have the professional skill sets, and the recommendation letters and the track record. So having the job guarantee from a business perspective actually provides you with a pool of employable workers.
I'll let you get to everyone else. I was like, one more follow-up question on this track. And so I agree with you with all of that. The only other part of that I think is tricky, right? As a socialist, as a member of Democratic Socialists of America, we have a sort of idea of what the economy should look like and the role everyone should play. And the thing that concerns me as far as that actually playing out is what I believe economists call sort of performativity, right? Walmart, we know, would benefit from this system. But sociologically, we know that it's not always about profit, it's also about power, right? So they would say, so in some sort of, if there is such a thing as an objective economic sense, Walmart would benefit. But in a sort of power, sort of political sense, Walmart likely would say, well, actually, this is going to drive us out of business. We don't like it. We're not paying wages. We're moving wherever we're moving. And so how do you respond to that aspect of it?
Walmart is moving?
Well,
they should. No, I mean, I get your point. Right. So here's another thing. There's so much that we can't pack into 2 hours, but so thank you for bringing this up. In places where things like the job guarantee have been piloted and experimented, the best example is Argentina during their crisis in the early 2000s, where there was a similar program that didn't pay a living wage, but it did employ 2 million people during the worst part of the Depression. Very decentralized, local, community-based kind of after-school programs, community kitchens, community gardens, all kinds of literacy programs in the most kind of socioeconomic excluded segment of society. One of the things that came out of that is political organizations that became a serious threat to the political establishment, meaning that workers who organized at the local level, organized community gardens, community kitchens, and after-school lessons and literacy programs and everything, then they started into this mode of, what do we need and how can we get it done? And then they said, well, we need a clinic, right? None of us is a doctor or nurse. This is not our responsibility. We can't do this at the local level. This is the responsibility of the government to provide us with hospitals and doctors and clinics and better schools for our kids. So they started organized politically, protesting. And that's why that participatory nature is not just participatory at the local level to get things done. It's political organizing too. It's democracy the birth of democracy is right there. And that became a threat to the political establishment, the left and the right in Argentina. And they decided, you know what, all of these people doing all this work and we're paying them, why not send them a welfare check and have them stay home? Meaning, kill the democratic process. Just give them a welfare check and have them be quiet. And that's exactly what they did, because as soon as the economy recovered, they said, we don't need this program anymore. It's just creating more trouble. But just give them, some money and have them stay home. So the job guarantee program is not a silver bullet that's going to restructure the entire thing. but it's going to set that minimum safety net standard. It's going to set democratic foundations for participation and political action. And then it's up to us to restructure the rest of the picture, to demonstrate that we can do it, that it's affordable, that it's effective, that it does address root causes. And then that becomes the stepping stone for larger political restructuring, including taxing the rich, taxing pollution, taxing gambling, then redesigning the economic infrastructure in a way that serves people, not serves the corporations. So it can't solve everything, but I think it does that.
Just more comment than anything else about the city-based things, at least in some states, such as Ohio is one of them, you need to keep an eye out for preemption. States keep trying to preempt local efforts. It doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it's something that you may want. You should expect you may encounter.
Right. It's not expected to be an easy trip down Main Street, as they say.
What are the effects of the jobs guarantee program that you had on board on, like, by itself, I guess, on inequality? Like, so one good reason to fund that by taxing the rich is that it just has this dual effect of helping some bring some up and others down a bit, lower the Gini coefficient or whatever. I guess more specifically, you had that great graph where, like, the returns to the 90% and the 10% during recoveries.
Yep.
Have you thought about how we implemented the jobs guarantee in 2008, say, would that have looked very different instead of it being like almost all going to the top 10% or all, I guess?
Absolutely. If you set up a job guarantee, because a job guarantee is designed to be the safety net, kind of one of the names that some economists use is the employer of last resort. So it hires off the bottom. It hires the category primarily that people in the business world refer to as unemployable. Unemployable is a code word for women and minorities and returning citizens and people with disabilities and all kinds of things, the unwanted groups. So it does aim at the lowest segment of what we call the labor market. And if you pay decent wages and benefits, you've established a solid foundation. If you've removed the potential for predatory lending, which targets primarily those categories, you've done quite a bit of restructuring right there. Right? But on the point of taxing the rich and tying it to funding the program, I think politically we may disagree. Politically, it may not be effective, and I think Bernie Sanders, and his focus on taxing the rich to fund education, whatever. So what if we're not successful, or what if we get somebody like Trump and undo that, and then we have no money for education, or we have no money for, instead of starting from the beginning with the right understanding of how the monetary system works and saying we don't need to tighten that. That's a separate issue. If we want to tax pollution for the sake of taxing pollution, we should do it. If we want to tax gambling for the sake of taxing gambling, we should do it because we want to reduce, those things in society. But what if we're actually successful at taxing pollution out of existence? Then how do we fund healthcare then? Right? What if there is no pollution to tax? What happens to the funds for healthcare? What if we're successful at taxing gambling out of existence? Then how do we fund schools? Right? So tying the two together is, in the long run, is like shooting ourselves in the foot. I do agree that we should tax the hell out of the super rich, just for the sake of getting the inequality thing addressed. And I think we should clarify our message that that's a problem in and of itself. Regardless, even if we had full employment, even if we had clean energy and everything else, we should still tax the rich, right? Because that's a problem in and of itself. But we need to be able to dissect these things and not tie one into the other. And if we don't get one, then we can't have anything and say there's nothing we can do, right? So it's very important for the progressives to get the funding part right so that our political strategy is more targeted and is not subject to what Hillary Clinton was trying to do. You're not going to be able to tax Wall Street, so we can't afford healthcare, you can't afford this and that. So there is no alternative. This is it. Take it or leave it. That's what the core progressive movement was saying during the last election, that it's not possible. Right? So, yes, please.
So, in your opinion, because it looks like you've been working on this for a while with a lot of academics, do you think this has the best shot at success through the political front at the municipal level, the county level, the state level, or obviously probably not the federal level? That's where your thoughts are.
Right.
Where do you realistically think something like this could work at that sort of electoral level?
The smaller the scale, the more politically feasible, I think, right now. But if we want economic efficiency, we want the larger scales. That being said, people working in this field, in the MMT community, the job guarantee community, the real progressives groups, we're working on all fronts. So we're working with candidates running at the local office or state and city level. We're working with candidates running for Congress. We're talking to people who are already in Congress and people who work for people who already are in elected office. It's just sometimes elected officials at the federal level, they hear a presentation like this. We go through all the details, and then they say, "Oh, that's interesting. So there is lots of possibilities." Yes, there is, but I can't do that. I can't say that publicly. Why? Because if you say, the federal government can do this, that, and the other, then, what about inflation? What about healthcare? If you're running for office and you're on the stage debating, candidates, for Congress or for Senate or for president, and the journalist from CNN says, "What are you going to do about the national debt?" 60 seconds. What's your answer? Well, we sat here for 2 hours to unpack this, and we're barely scratching the surface. What kind of answer are you going to give in a 60-second, debate setting? If you say, "Well, the government can afford it, and we can pay for it," and then you cut off, and you can't get the rest of the story through, then you can imagine the media attacks. "Oh, this person needs to take Econ 101. They don't know anything about finance. They want to ruin the government. They want hyperinflation. They want Zimbabwe. They want the Weimar Republic." And this is attacks from both progressives and conservatives. So we end up with, the least we can do is educate people who are sitting there in Congress and Senate voting for these things. They don't have to become MMT advocates in public, but at least they should vote accordingly. They should vote common sense as opposed to perpetuating nonsense about we can't afford it. I mean, even the Trump tax cut, the attacks from Democrats opposing it is, it's a bad idea because the deficit and the national debt now are even higher. As if that's the problem, right? The deficit that we need to worry about is the deficit of jobs, the deficit of ideas, the deficit of, the debt and the deficit that households have, the deficit of infrastructure and resources and education. Those are the deficits, the real deficits that matter. Instead, most, mainstream progressives will tell you that the deficit that matters is the federal government deficit. And remember that MMT picture that I showed you, the 3 sector balances. If you kill that deficit, then you and I and the non-government sector will have to carry that burden. And that's really why we need to shift the conversation using some of these tools.
I just wanted to point out, we have about 5 minutes left.
I need to go to Olivia because she had her hand.
Real quick. Do you have concerns about automation and how it would impact the job?
Good question. Yeah.
Because it's like a
nightmare. There's a lot of obsession about the robots are coming and what are we going to do when the robots take over. I say when the robots show up, we should celebrate. We should have them take over all the precarious, dangerous work, and because technology is not new. Robots, the concept of robots, is mechanization. It started with the Industrial Revolution. There were Luddites in England who tried to fight it, and literally you break into factories and destroy machines because they're evil creatures that take away your livelihood, right? Yes, mechanization can displace worker and have displaced worker for a long time and will never stop displacing workers. It's up to us to reinvent the society and the economy in which we want to live and find more fulfilling things for us to do. And the job guarantee offers this perspective because we're not going to be producing machines and producing, trucks and cars for GM and GE, but we're going to be producing care services, caring for each other, caring for the elderly, caring for the environment, caring for a better quality of life. And that's a very fulfilling task. Caring for people is something that robots cannot do. I mean, you can have robots, mechanization in hospitals, right, to help a nurse, lift the patient off the bed and whatever. And some of those tools already exist, by the way, right? And that's making the job of a nurse or a doctor easier, better, healthier. But it's not replacing the fact that you need a skilled doctor or a skilled nurse. It's not replacing the fact that you need talented teachers in the classroom, passionate teachers in the classroom. There's all kinds of things that don't have market value today because, the care economy is mostly unpaid and, invisible. But this is an opportunity to celebrate technological advances, but find a way for the rest of us to have decent livelihood, a decent income, doing things that complement what robots will be doing in the manufacturing sector and other sectors. So I'm not going to stop technological advance to save jobs that can't be saved. Ultimately, there will be, but we need to save people from unemployment, from the negative consequences of that. And people who say, the only way to do it is to stop robots or to tax robots is not. We're shooting ourselves in the foot again. Yes, please.
I have a comment along the lines of automation subsidy as well as the jobs guarantee program raises the bar on wages, and private sector employers are trying to win over these employees. They're going to have to offer better conditions, better jobs, more fulfilling work. And some of the really crappy jobs that are not really, they don't produce as much. They're going to say, oh, well, I can't hire all these workers to take these orders. Well, maybe that's where the automation can come in, to do those jobs that nobody really gets a lot of fulfillment doing.
Sure.
And the employers would say, well, okay, we'll eliminate these jobs, and then only the better jobs.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it requires this kind of rethinking of how we organize society. What should we prioritize for human work that has to be enjoyable, fulfilling, fulfills our human capabilities, versus things that can't be automated away. Right? You see. Let me ask Steve if he has questions from the Facebook page.
So Fadhel, I don't know if you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
So we have some questions. A couple of them came up. Like, can you describe what some real resources might be other than just labor? What are some of the real resources when we talk about the limits of spending? What might some of those be?
So let's say we decide we want to build more airports, or we want to build railroads, or we want to build whatever infrastructure. And we have a job guarantee program, and everybody's either employed in the private sector, the government sector, or the nonprofit sector, or in the job guarantee sector. And now the federal government decides, you know what, we want to build more highways, or we want to build more infrastructure. Number one, the entire labor force is employed. But you can think of also all the construction companies that have the material resources to build those new highways. They're already employed fully doing private business development projects. And the only way for the federal government to get that new highway built is to bid up the price and hire them away from an existing project in the private sector. So you can think of this situation where the physical resources, the cement, the infrastructure, the cement, the trucks, the equipment, the skilled labor that does the construction is fully employed. And yet we want to build more of that resource. So we're increasing the demand, but the productive capacity is weak. And that's guaranteeing bidding up of that pricing, guaranteeing inflation. But if we design the government spending strategy to focus on the pockets of the economy where there's unused labor, unused physical resources, machinery, tools, trucks, cement, or whatever, that's where the spending should be targeted. But if we target the pockets of the economy that has no spare capacity, we're guaranteeing that prices will go up. And that's why I used the example earlier. If you want to offer free dental care for everyone, you want to make sure that you have the productive capacity. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a situation where it will feed back into inequality by bidding up prices, and then only those who can afford it. And then killing the program by saying, look, we told you it's going to raise, government intervention raises the cost of doing business, right? Because the government is creating inflation. So I hope that helps.
Yep. So one more question. The UBI is all the rage with neoliberals. It's all the rage with the Koch brothers. It was something with the negative income tax that Milton Friedman, of all people, wanted to push for. It seems all the Silicon Valley wealthy want to push for it, like Zuckerberg and others. Can you explain why a UBI in and of itself, by itself, is not only inflationary, but not necessarily a progressive value as a standalone entity, why it doesn't serve the needs of the people, and why a job guarantee is superior?
I hope people in the back were able to hear the question. So Steve is asking about UBI, Universal Basic Income. There's a lot of debate about this in the media, especially because it's been endorsed by a lot of CEOs in Silicon Valley, Facebook and Uber and all of these. So UBI, I want to start, if we have a few minutes, Adam, a couple minutes. I can do it really fast.
Nobody's by the door.
Nobody's leaving. Okay. Feel free to leave. This is recorded anyway.
I just don't know if anybody has an address, so that's all.
Oh, the room, yes. Yeah. So there's two UBI approaches in my head. One is what I call the Silicon Valley UBI, which is kind of the recent phenomenon. And then there's the kind of the deeper philosophical academic UBI, which is, once the robots take over the system, for example, what are we going to do, right? And how do people make a living? And then it's really the idea of emancipation from having to work for somebody else. That's really the deeper philosophical thing. Then if everybody gets a universal basic income that's sufficient, a living wage type of thing, then we can do the community arts things, and we can do music, and we can do the care economy voluntarily, not because we're forced into it. So I have appreciation for that kind of philosophical discussion, but we're not even close there. So I'm not going to waste more time on it. But I'm happy to debate these things philosophically. In terms of the UBI proposals from Silicon Valley, and there is actually an experiment happening right now, I think in Oakland, where one of the CEOs is paying for 100 or 200 people to experiment their UBI. They're paying them $1,300 or $1,400 a month. That's not a living wage in Oakland, California. But the proposals are actually consistent with the neoliberal model of what I call the Uberization of the economy, meaning, we'll give you a basic income so that you can pay for basic food and rent, but you're really not going to be able to make it through the month. So you will need to work for Uber. You will need to work part-time somewhere here and there. No wage, no benefits, no health care, no, safety net. So we give you the basics so that you let them eat cake type of thing. But then you'll still have to work for us, because the business model of Uber is actually not, if you sit down and break down the numbers, if you're working full-time as an Uber driver using your car, then that's your business. So you have to take into account not just the $20 that people pay for a quick ride, but you have to take into account the wear and tear, the taxes, the insurance, the cost of gas. You add up all the numbers, and it turns out, on an hourly basis, you're making less than the minimum wage. We're taking a step back with no health insurance, no benefits, nothing else, right? So of course, if you work for Uber, you do need a subsidy from somebody, right? From a UBI or from the federal government or whatever. So I see this as an attempt to really take that picture that we looked at earlier and tear it apart and make it even worse in terms of pushing the working class and removing more of the safety nets under the label, philosophical label of everybody deserves a basic income. And no wonder that it's coming mostly from Silicon Valley, especially from these new disruptive type of business models, Uber and Airbnb and all of those things. It's fine if you're an Uber driver, make a few bucks here and there occasionally, but to make it a way of living, a source of livelihood, it doesn't work. It will never work. And yet we're seeing attempts to push this beyond, to make this a generalized system so that everybody's hustling for work left and right with no benefits, no safety net, except $1,300 basic income so that you can't complain. And of course, the universal basic income is going to replace all other social subsidies, right? Because now you have a basic income. What else do you need? So I agree with your assessment, Steve, that this is, or whoever asked the question, that this is really sort of the Trojan horse of neoliberalism. That this is a trap. You know, progressives should not line up behind the UBI bandwagon. Okay.
Thank you so much.
I think we're good with Steve's question, and thank you all for being here. I'll be happy to take more questions. I'm still here, but feel free to email me, find me online, find me on social media, find Real Progressives on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. There's lots and lots of excellent programming, interviews with candidates across the country.
So, folks, that concludes our broadcast. Fadhel had to leave. The room was being taken. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you learned a lot. I know I did. This is exactly what Real Progressives is here for. I'm grateful for the Democratic Socialists of America in Columbus for elevating modern monetary theory and for elevating a federal job guarantee. Thank you all very much. This is a war. We're in it to win it. Everybody keep fighting. Have a great day, everyone. Peace out.